He didn't lose his home in a courtroom. He didn't lose it in public. He lost it in silence. On a Monday night in February 2026, Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor slipped out of Royal Lodge, the 30-room mansion he'd lived in for over 20 years, and he did it under cover of darkness. Not because of a storm, not because of security, because the humiliation of leaving in daylight was worse. And when he arrived at his new address on the King's Sandringham Estate, something happened that would have been unthinkable in the old royal world. Staff were reportedly told they didn't have to serve him if they felt uncomfortable. Think about that. A man who once stood at state dinners, shook hands with presidents, and represented Britain abroad, reduced to a royal relative nobody wants to be seen helping. So what really happened behind palace doors? Why did the move suddenly get rushed? And what was inside the latest wave of Epstein files that reportedly made it clear to him it was time to go? Before the scandals, before the files, before the exile, Andrew was the royal family's boldest asset. Born inside Buckingham Palace in 1960, he grew up surrounded by ceremony, protection, and expectation. As the third child of Queen Elizabeth II, he wasn't destined to be king, but for years he stood just one step away from it. And in the 1980s, his image couldn't have been stronger. He flew helicopters during the Falklands War. Newspapers painted him as fearless, a young royal who actually went to war. That reputation followed him home and elevated him. He wasn't just another palace figure. He was seen as action-oriented, confident, even untouchable. Then came the wedding in 1986, global coverage, crowds flooding the streets, a fairy tale moment that seemed to cement his place as one of the monarchy's central figures. For a time, everything about him signaled permanence. And then there was Royal Lodge. In 2003, Andrew secured a 75-year lease on the sprawling Windsor Estate property, 30 rooms set across nearly 100 acres. The upfront payment, a fraction of its long-term value. The annual rent, a symbolic peppercorn if demanded. In practical terms, he lived in a property worth tens of millions of pounds while paying virtually nothing for it. At the time, few questioned it. That was simply how royal privilege worked. But as public scrutiny grew over the years, the optics shifted. What once looked like tradition began to look like entitlement. And that perception would become critical later. Because while Royal Lodge symbolized stability and status, it would eventually become the very place tied to some of the most damaging allegations of his life. And the storm gathering around him was far bigger than a housing controversy. For years, Andrew's reputation survived on one powerful idea, that no matter what people whispered, the monarchy would protect him. And then he went on television and destroyed that protection in under an hour. By 2019, his friendship with Jeffrey Epstein was no longer just an awkward footnote. Epstein had already been convicted. The world knew what he was. And yet Andrew's connection to him kept resurfacing like a stain that wouldn't wash out. So the palace made a decision that, in hindsight, looks almost unbelievable. Andrew agreed to sit down for a televised interview with the BBC. It was meant to be a reset, a calm explanation, a controlled moment where he could shut down the rumours and move on. Instead, it became one of the most infamous royal interviews ever broadcast. Not because of one single quote, but because of the tone. Viewers didn't just hear denial, they heard coldness, distance, a complete lack of empathy for the women involved, and the more he spoke, the worse it got. Details that sounded rehearsed, explanations that sounded unrealistic, and an overall vibe that left the public stunned. By the time the interview ended, the damage was already done. Within days, Andrew was forced to step back from public duties. The palace didn't frame it as punishment, but everyone understood what it was: a quiet removal. And that was the moment his public identity cracked. Because once a royal stops being useful, once they stop being a symbol, they become something else entirely: a liability. For a while, it looked like the strategy would work. Andrew stayed out of sight, the palace kept things vague, and in 2022, a civil case tied to Virginia Giuffre ended in an out-of-court settlement. The amount was never officially confirmed, but estimates quickly ran into the millions. And that's where many people assumed the story would end: a settlement, a retreat, a slow fade into private life. But that wasn't what happened, because just when it seemed like the worst was over, the spotlight came back even harsher. And the next wave didn't come from Britain, it came from the United States. Just when the story felt like it was fading, it exploded. January 30th, 2026. The US Department of Justice released millions of pages tied to Jeffrey Epstein. Documents, emails, flight logs, images. A massive digital archive dumped into the public sphere almost overnight. And buried inside it were references that dragged Andrew's name right back into the center of the storm. Photos circulated, alleged email exchanges from 2010 resurfaced, descriptions of introductions, meetings, arrangements. None of it new in theme, but the scale was different this time. It wasn't speculation, it was volume. Then came something even more damaging. A lawyer told the BBC his client claimed she had been sent to the UK in 2010 for an encounter with Andrew, and that it allegedly took place at Royal Lodge itself. For the first time, a royal residence was directly named in connection with these claims. That changed everything. Because Royal Lodge wasn't just a house, it was Crown Estate property, symbolic, protected, tied to the monarchy's image. Thames Valley Police confirmed they were reviewing the material. Across the Atlantic, political voices began applying pressure. Calls for Andrew to testify before US lawmakers gained traction. There was no legal mechanism to force it, but the public conversation was loud. And then came something even more damaging. A Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir hit shelves months earlier. It reignited attention, interviews, commentary, headlines all over again. The narrative shifted from old scandal to unfinished story. And inside palace walls, the calculation reportedly changed. Because scandals can sometimes be managed, but fresh documents, new allegations, and international pressure, that's when institutions protect themselves. And that's exactly what happened next. The decision didn't come with fanfare. It came with a statement. In October 2025, King Charles formally removed Andrew's remaining titles and royal affiliations. No more honorary military roles, no more official standing. The shift was historic. The last time a British prince had been stripped of status like that was over a century ago. It wasn't just symbolic, it was final. Inside the palace, the message was clear. Distance had become survival. Then came Royal Lodge. For years, Andrew had held a 75-year lease on the 30-room estate, paying what critics described as a peppercorn rent, essentially nothing compared to its market value. The arrangement had already drawn scrutiny, but after the latest wave of Epstein files and renewed attention, that privilege became harder to defend. His departure had originally been expected around Easter. Instead, it was accelerated. February 2nd, 2026. Late, quiet, no ceremony. Andrew left in the dark. Sources later suggested the humiliation of a daytime exit was too much, so the move happened at night, away from lenses and headlines. But the headlines came anyway. His temporary destination was Wood Farm Cottage on the Sandringham Estate, a modest property compared to Royal Lodge, and almost immediately another blow surfaced. Staff had reportedly been informed they could refuse to work for him if they felt uncomfortable. That detail hit harder than any official statement, because royal status has always meant automatic deference, structure, hierarchy. Now even that had shifted. No titles, no residence, no guaranteed household. What had once looked like temporary damage was starting to resemble permanent exile, and the contrast inside the royal family only made it sharper.
The strangest part of Andrew's downfall isn't the legal pressure, it's the silence. Because in the modern monarchy, reputation is everything, and Andrew now exists in a space where nobody wants to claim him, defend him, or even be photographed near him. Even within royal circles, the contrast has been brutal. Around the same time the latest Epstein material resurfaced, Andrew's brother, Edward, was approached by a journalist and asked about it. His response was short, controlled and telling. Sympathy for the victims. That single moment drew a line the public couldn't ignore. One side of the family still speaking the language of duty, the other reduced to avoidance, denial and retreat. And Andrew's retreat is now physical. Wood Farm Cottage isn't meant to be permanent, it's a stopgap, a holding pattern. Reports suggest he's expected to move again, this time to a property known as Marsh Farm, once renovations are complete. Even Sarah Ferguson's future is uncertain. Her spokesperson has offered only vague statements about assessing options. No united front, no reassuring family image, just distance. And that's the point. Because for someone like Andrew, the punishment isn't just losing titles, it's losing the world that came with them, the staff, the deference, the illusion of permanence. Once you're labelled a liability, the doors don't slam dramatically, they simply stop opening. And what makes this story so unsettling is that the humiliation doesn't seem to be ending, it seems to be settling in. What makes Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor's collapse so gripping isn't just the scandal, it's what it represents. For decades, royal privilege worked like armour. It didn't matter what rumours circulated, the institution absorbed the damage and carried on. But this time, the institution didn't absorb it, it pushed it away. A man who once stood near the centre of the monarchy has been reduced to a quiet figure moving between properties, stripped of status, stripped of protection, and now reportedly avoided even by the people whose job used to be serving him. And the most cutting line of all didn't come from a palace source, it came from Virginia Giuffre's brother, who summed it up with a kind of brutal simplicity. An ordinary American girl from an ordinary American family brought down a British prince. Andrew still denies all allegations, but denial doesn't rebuild reputation, and it doesn't reopen doors once they've been closed. Because the real punishment here isn't legal, it's social, it's permanent. And if the past few months have proven anything, it's this. For Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the humiliation wasn't a single moment. It was the beginning of a new life, where the fall doesn't end, it just keeps getting lower.